Welcome to Raising Daughters, the podcast that helps parents learn the best ways to support their daughters as they navigate the high levels of stress, anxiety, pressure, and uncertainty so pervasive in our culture today. Dr. Tim Jordan is a developmental and behavioral pediatrician who has specialized in counseling girls for over 30 years and sheds light on the realities of today's young women in all facets of their lives. This is your opportunity to learn how to better support your daughters, making them feel safe, secure, and truly loved in the midst of life's ups and downs. Here is your host, Dr. Tim.
Hello, friends. Dr. Tim Jordan here, welcoming you back to a new episode of Raising Daughters. It's a place where every week I pick a topic about girls, about raising girls, about what's going on for girls, try and get into the heads and the hearts of girls to give you some information, some awarenesses, and hopefully some tools that will help you navigate those years of grade school, middle school, high school, college, and beyond in raising a daughter. And I was triggered to do the topic today by a girl I saw in my office. Not a girl, actually, a young woman. She's a junior in college. And I was working with her on a Zoom visit. She's in college because of some anxiety, a lot of uncertainty coming up. She's approaching her last year in college and a lot of uncertainty. And so that triggered a lot of anxiety in her. And one of the things that I discovered in my conversation with her was that her parents still have her on that 360 app. So they can still follow her around her day. They know where she is every second of every day. And that started back in I think in sixth grade when she got her first phone. And it's continued. And she's now 21 years of age and her parents are still following her around. I also was triggered by a parent who, in conversation with her and her daughter in my office, this mom, knew more about her daughter's schedule, and she knew more up-to-date information on her daughter's grades, her GPA, and each of her classes than her daughter did because of one of those systems. I think it's called Infinite Campus at their school. So her parents, this girl's parents, can follow her around. They know everything going on for her. And that the problem with that, number one, is it causes parents to have a hard time not jumping in and micromanaging because they know every little detail, but also because it's not giving the space for the girl to figure things out on her own. But those two situations, plus many more, caused me to start judging those parents, which I don't like to do. Judging those parents as being too hovering, too protective, being one of those typical helicopter parents that we like to call them the last 10 or 20 years. So I thought I would go back in history. I've read a lot of books on history of all kinds of things, but I've read lots of books on the history of parenting, also on the history of parental anxiety over the years, to try and give me, a better sense of why are parents becoming helicopter parents more often these days. So instead of judging them, let's try and understand and take them off the hook. After I gave you this information on this podcast, I hope that you will start looking at yourself and other parents that you see that are helicoptering their kids with more understanding. There's reasons why we become so anxious in our parenting, especially over the last 20 or so years, but it started way longer, or way before that. Back in the 1880s, home became the mother's domain. Dad started going off to work. People started moving to cities. They moved away from the farm. So mom stayed at home. Dads went to work. And so part of the message that parents got was the world is becoming faster. It's busier. It's louder. We're living in cities. And so there was some concern about that and some anxiety about that. Back in the 19th century, kids were viewed as being sturdy. They were hardy and sturdy, and they were going to grow up just fine unless some adults, their parents or someone, kind of corrupted them. And that hardiness, that look that we saw of kids back in the 1800s started changing in the 1900s. We started changing our ideas about kids and our kids' nature. we started seeing kids as more frail and more vulnerable. They'd be readily overburdened with things, and they required very careful handling. Otherwise, they would go off the rails. Kids were going to develop character flaws unless we stepped in and helped take care of things for them. So the outlook about kids was that they're fragile, and that childhood was a problem-filled, dangerous endeavor, if you will. In the early 1900s, we had several waves of immigrants, and that caused a lot of parents to worry because these new people from other countries were coming into our kids' lives. There's all these immigrant kids working in the streets, walking around the streets. There's also a more dangerous urban world, if you will, the city life. So that caused parents to start worrying. I have a quote from a Dr. Holt from 1910. Let me read it to you. It said, "In this speeded up world that has arrived, it's no longer possible to rely on for parents to rely on their let's see, I messed that up. It no longer seemed possible to rely on their parents as guides to new child-rearing challenges. Their kids were growing up in settings so different from the ones in which they had passed their childhoods. Things had changed. The outlook and how we looked at kids had changed. So a lot of parents started to worry because I'm not sure if I understand what I'm supposed to be doing here. My kids are so different." Another quote from 1930, Father Flanagan from Boys Town. "His deepest worry of those days was the temper of the times, the crass materialism, the breakdown of religious training in the home, the soaring divorce rate, leaving a trail of broken families and children shunted from one indifferent parent to another." 1930. So there was a lot of concern back then about things breaking down in the family. Things are different. More materialism. Things are starting to speed up. 1950s, 1960s brought this elusive quest for happiness. We had to start keeping up with the Joneses next door. So if they got a new car, they got a new appliance, we had to keep up. And so there was some anxiety about that. New technologies, new appliances, new homes, moving to the suburbs and away from grandparents. It used to be prior to that time that a lot of parents lived in the same townhouse as their grandparents, as their parents, same apartment building. There was 2 or 3 floors, so there was a different generation on each floor. So that in the 1950s, with the people moving out to the suburbs a lot, not everybody, but a lot of people, we started losing contact with families. Families became a little bit more spread out, if you will. Here's a quote from Margaret Mead from 1950. "American children are growing up within the most rapidly changing culture of which we have any record in the world. Within a culture where for several generations, every generation's experience has sharply differed from the past one. So that these expectations of change and anxiety about change have been built into our character as a people." Things are changing. People are experiencing that. Parents are experiencing that. It caused more anxiety within parents. How do I prepare my kids for their future when I don't know what their future is going to look like because things are shifting so quickly? Put a lot of pressure on parents to do it right. There are more child-rearing experts. Dr. Spock was one of the ones that comes to mind in the 1950s, but he wasn't the only one. In the 1960s, 1970s, I think we lost our sense of solidarity, reciprocal obligation. We started knowing our neighbors less. Vietnam hit, the civil rights movement hit. Our kids were out of control. We had hippies, kids with long hair, people dropping out, a lot of drugs, sexuality. So that was a huge shift and a huge change that brought on, obviously, a lot of concern, a lot of angst and anger and unrest in the whole culture, which, of course, kind of transcended down into our homes as well. 1970s, people started talking about the breakdown of the family. That picked up in the 80s. The birth rate started going down. People were using birth control more. Moms were working more, starting in the 60s and 70s, and that increased in the 80s. So we started talking about latchkey kids who were home without their parents after school and before school. The divorce rate, again, was climbing. There was a war on teenagers at that time. Teens were out of control. There was a lot of stories in the news about these kids these teenagers who were doing delinquent things. 70s was also still part of that sexual revolution. Drugs, there was the highest rate of drugs and sexuality in our teenagers was back in the 70s and 80s. The women's liberation movement hit. And so there was pressure on women to go to work and to have a career and to have it all, if you will. Parents started becoming more and more anxious that their kids were going to get behind. Especially as they were rushing off to work, they felt like, are my kids going to suffer because I'm working and because dad's working as well? There's concerned about early sophistication, sexualization, especially after the 60s and the 70s, and also because there were more and more images being shown on TV and in the movies. It was interesting at that time in the 80s that kids were represented in the movies as being demons a lot. Those were the years where we saw The Exorcist, we watched Rosemary's Baby, we watched The Omen, we watched Carrie. I think it reflected, in a sense, our worry about what's all these changes doing to our kids. How's it affecting them? Because parents were both working more and more, parents started sharing their child rearing with non-family members, preschool teachers. Kids spent more and more time with their sports and their coaches, enrichment teachers in classes, TV shows. I think parents felt more at risk than their kids in a sense because of all those changes and because of all the information and all the images their kids were being bombarded with. And that was before the internet. That was before social media. I think parents worrying about their kids was even more so for people who were living in poverty. Two-parent working families. I think there was more stress on them than it was on parents who had some higher income, and also where only maybe one parent was working. Parents started to get a sense of, am I being a good enough parent? I'm only having, maybe 2.5 kids now. I'm not having 4 kids or 6 kids, or like in my family, 8 kids, my family growing up. And so there's a sense of, since I have less kids, I need to put more energy into them. I have more time and energy to put into them, perhaps. And so they started to think about this ladder to success, the race to nowhere, if you will. Parents became more and more obsessed with their kids being the best and their kids being on the best teams and getting straight A's and going to college and being successful. Because if I was a good enough parent, my kids would be on the best teams, they'd be getting straight A's, blah, blah, blah. That became more of an issue for parents, which caused them to, put more energy into it and sometimes too much energy. A 2001 study found that there had been a 25% increase in the amount of time that kids were spending with their parents from previous generations. And of course, parents were having less kids. They were living, not a lot more people were living in child-intensive suburban places. There was a lot of patterns there. You had soccer moms. There's increased value placed on each kid. Kids are now seen as more special and unique. And also, kids were a choice now. There are lots of ways to, with birth control and all, to not have a kid. And so there's more pressure to, if I'm going to have these kids, if I'm going to choose to have kids, by God, they're going to be successful. I also think anxious parents were turning more and more to child experts, child rearing experts, advice books. And this promoted more levels of concern about being a good enough parent, or even worse, by being a perfect parent. And of course, a lot of the advice was conflicting, which could put more pressure on parents, who are they going to listen to? Grandparents became less likely to be living with or near their kids and their grandkids. That started back in the 1920s. I think parents started to veer away from listening to their parents' advice. There's a really nice quote that I saw from an Angela Lansbury podcast, and it goes like this. People used to raise kids the way they made Kegel and meatballs, in accordance with the traditions of their culture, picking and choosing from the slight variations they observed among their cousins, grandmothers, aunts, uncles. What was once a matter of experience has become a matter of expertise. The trend, she argued, had been exacerbated by Americans having kids later in life. We have goals to achieve. We have to study up. And that's made it much harder. I think that's true. I think in the past, I think it was we listened to our grandma, our grandpa, or our parents because they were living right there or close by. It was easier to get that our family's advice because it tended to be the same, but then you start looking outside of that because our family wasn't right there. Then all of a sudden, you got all kinds of information, piling in, and then it started coming through media as well, through television, especially even before the internet. Even before the internet, there was still a lot of information coming in. I also think that parents at that time, back in the early 2000s, started to feel more isolated because both parents were working, because people were busier, and they became more and more busy. There's less time just to hang out in the neighborhood. People started not knowing their neighbors as well, being outside, hanging out with the neighbors because people were at a soccer camp or people were at a club tournament of some kind. There was less sense of camaraderie, a less sense of finding support from people who you lived next door to or nearby. So I think people did feel more isolated and alone, and that's continued and increased through today. We also started thinking of kids as being vulnerable. Kids who'd be overwhelmed unless parents provided protection. Parents were advised to help their kids avoid any kind of anxious or fear-provoking situations. Instead of thinking of kids as having bravery and courage and pluck, we started talking about kids who were vulnerable and in need of coddling, in need of being protected and guided. They wouldn't use the word micromanage, but that became a word. We were less interested in courage and more interested in coping skills because our kids were so vulnerable and the world had become scarier and scarier. Parenting became more child-centered. Parents feeling more responsible for their kids and their future. It's like parents became their kids' entertainment directors. We started doing more and more and more because of the pressure we were feeling from those around us, from the culture, from the experts. I think it made it harder for parents not to micromanage. Also, I've made a list here about reasons why kids might be expected to be anxious, starting in the 2000s and through today. Let me just read off this list really quick. Just things that our kids are experiencing today. First of all, 24/7 news. That started before recently, but that and the internet news, the pandemic. And there was more than one pandemic, by the way. We just went through one 4 years ago, but there was other ones prior to that. Terrorist attacks, 9/11, violence on TV shown with people, not even just people, hurting and killing each other, but also violence against the police officers, riots in the streets. There's a war on crime, school shootings, more and more, and getting more and more coverage, by the way. The storming of the U.S. Capitol a few years ago, intruder drills at school. Now we've got teachers who are wanting to be armed. We have police officers in schools walking around who are obviously armed. The 24/7 news cycle, STDs. We went through the AIDS crisis back in the 80s and the 90s. We hear so much about the degradation of the environment, the effects of global warming, and what that's going to do for our future. These days, the polarity in our political scene, the polarity between people because of people being so divided in their thinking and so intense about it that people no longer have time to listen to each other. Kids pick up on that. They pick up on that sense of not just the polarity, but the anger, the intensity and the anger there are in adults, in the culture, in the political scene. Just watch what politicians are saying today. It's so angry and so disrespectful. That wasn't the case 30, 40, 50 years ago. I mentioned before about how lonely and isolated people are becoming. People have been frantically trying to get their kids on the top teams, and they want their kids to be unique, and they want their kids to be the best. They want their kids to have straight A's. They want their kids to go to a top college and get a great job, and make a lot of money. And all that pressure about keeping up with the Joneses, children are surpassing them, has created a lot of angst in parents and angst in children. It's harder for parents not to get involved. So much pressure for their kids to be perfect, for them to be perfect as parents, for the kids to end up on these best teams, best colleges. So it's hard not to get our hands in there and micromanage, because that's what the standard is now, supposedly. We also talked back in the 1990s and 2000s about the crucial early years. Parents were told your children's future is at stake. If you're not in that delivery room, if you're not bonded to your kid immediately, then your kid's going to have a crummy outlook. We've worried especially since TV, the television, we've worried about the effect of technologies on our kids. So that started a lot in the 50s. And obviously, besides the TV, then we had the internet, then we had video games, then we had social media, and all those devices and things that came into our homes felt scary. They were new, scary. There are questions about, are these bad for our kids? Our kids became overstimulated. The whole culture is overstimulated. That increased the whole emphasis on competition and achievement and consumerism and sexualization of our kids. And a lot of people were worried about what's that doing to family values, because our kids are getting so much information from so many places that we don't seem to have control over. So it's not kids who are just getting their values from watching their parents and listening to their parents. Now they're listening to people from all over the world in every walk of life. Here's a quote from someone, it's an unknown quote. Parents are confronted with an elusive quest to keep up with fellow Americans on an unknown chart called happiness, with progress dependent upon their children's achievements, upon the way in which he shows up against other kids, guaranteeing insecurity all around. That's that race to nowhere concept. That's that keeping up with the Joneses' children. Not about appliances today, not about cars, not about clothes. It's about what team is your kid on? What soccer camp are they going to this summer? What college are they going to attend? So I think parents and all these concerns have caused parents to feel really insecure about themselves and the job they're doing as parenting. There's a lot of pressure on them for their kids to get a college scholarship, to get into a good college, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think it's so hard for parents today to not get their hands in there and micromanage and do too much. I get it. This pressure has been building for a long time, and it's gotten worse. I think parents, a lot of times today, a lot of parents are in homes where both parents work. Not everybody, but a lot of parents. And I think parents are tired because their work follows them home. We're never off from work. There's less time off. I've talked to a lot of moms and dads who talk about how hard it is to switch off when they walk in the door at home, switch off that sense of I'm in charge of everything and I need to make sure everything's in alignment like I do at work. And it's hard to switch off into a different kind of pattern in the home. I also think a couple other things. 9/11 happened, and I think the whole culture was traumatized, including children and parents. I think it heightened our fears about our kids. Some kids were cut off from their parents that day because phones weren't working and because of all the things that happened on that day. Kids were placed in shelters without phones because their parents may have been in one of those towers. And a lot of parents, even if they weren't directly involved, a lot of parents vowed that they would never let their kids be disconnected from them. I think the whole society got terrorized by all that. I think cell phones became a symbol of parental security, emotional safety. There's this sense of having some comfort when you have continuous connection with your kids. I think, that's filtered down to our kids who have learned that they need a phone to feel safe, that to have constant connection with their parents. There's a movement afoot, which I agree with, that we shouldn't have kids having phones in school. And a lot of parents' argument is, what if something happened? What if there's a school shooting? What if? Fear, fear, fear. What if I'm going to be a little bit late picking my kid up? Or if my kid wants to stay after late? And there's all these arguments when the truth is, today, it's more safe than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago when it comes to things like abductions, kidnappings. That is a fact. But we don't act like it's a fact because there is a kidnapping or an abduction or something of that sort. And then it hits the news and it's 24/7. And it's hard not to believe then that everybody's in danger everywhere at every moment. So then we hover. And we're even told by the news people, do not let your kids out of your sight. How many times have parents been told that? So it's hard to let our kids be out of our sight, like most of us were growing up. I think most of us growing up had a lot more freedom to be out and about than our kids have. I was down the street with my buddies. We would take our bikes miles away. We would be playing hockey in the street with kids from different neighborhoods. We were shooting BB guns and pellet guns out in the woods. And we didn't come home till dinner. We were gone all day. And we did fine. And not only did we do fine, but we learned a lot of really, really, really important lessons out there in the world about taking care of ourselves, how to handle risk, how to make mistakes and take responsibility for our mistakes and our actions. We learned to lead. We learned to solve our own problems. We learned to take care of ourselves and our friends and our siblings. There's so much good learning that happened out in the world that our kids are missing because we're so afraid to let them out of our sights. Because being a good parent today means you got to have that 360 thing and be in constant contact. And if I text my kid and they don't call back within 10 minutes, then I'm worried, I'm scared. I start calling all their friends. I might even call the police. It's almost that bad. That's the kind of helicopter parenting. And I get it because we've been inundated with fearful messages from the culture, from the media. I also think college became the gold standard, at least college. And it's become hard to get into college, especially since the last 30, 40 years. College has become progressively more expensive. And parents and kids are beginning the message that you can't just go to college. You need to go to a good college if you want to get a good job, if you want to make a lot of money. I've talked about that kind of thinking in past podcasts. And so it's hard for parents not to over worry and overdo because that's the model that they're supposed to be following. That's the script. It's hard not to get in there and push your kids to get straight A's, and if your kid doesn't get an A, to not call the teacher. And that even includes parents who call college professors when their kids aren't getting a good grade. So we have to be available. We have to be pushing and pressuring. I think it's caused a lot of anxiety. I did a podcast recently about how new parents these days seem more anxious than in previous times. And part of the argument was that not all, but many parents are having kids later. On average now, it's more like late 20s, early 30s to have their first kid. Same thing goes for marriage. And because of that, a lot of parents, more than before, are having problems getting pregnant. It's taken longer. Some of them have to go through in vitro fertilization. Then there may be a miscarriage or two in there. And so it ramps up the angst about children even. About, am I going to be able to have a kid? Am I going to be able to get pregnant? There's all kinds of worries about if you have a child when you're older, they're more at risk for having issues, more at risk for having some difficulties. So that's another thing that I think is causing parents to hover. Plus, we've gotten all the pressure again about you need to get your kid on the top club team by the time they're 7 or 8, so that they can be in line for a college scholarship in sports, especially a college scholarship to a top college, blah, 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 blah. So there's so much pressure on kids to get straight A's, for kids to be on the best teams. And I think that pressure comes from not just parents, it also comes from the culture. It comes from this very expensive and very money conscious youth sports industry that's racking in billions of dollars every year by kids being involved in all those teams. I also think parents have gotten the message from the culture that our kids should be happy, that they shouldn't be anxious, they shouldn't be sad. If there's any signs of any of those sorts of symptoms, I think we're so quick to label, diagnose, medicate. because our kids should be happy. We haven't taught our kids very well that those are normal emotions. Things like anxiety, uncertainty, like these young people I see who are going off into college and they're so anxious. There's so much uncertainty about this new transition, and they haven't had the chance to cope with adversity because their parents did too much for them, because their parents were worried about their kids keeping up and all those reasons. The other thing, there's a book that I read this past year called The Anxious Generation. It's a great book. I would suggest you read it, by Jonathan Haidt, Haidt. He talks in the book about how we started shifting from a play-based childhood to a phone-based childhood, meaning that kids used to be out and about playing in the streets, as I was talking about, and now they spend more time on their devices. And our kids have lost out a lot on that. Our kids are less resilient. They're less independent. They have a hard time coping with things because they haven't been out in the world learning how to cope with things. They haven't been out in the world learning how to overcome adversities. And our parents see that, and so that their parents feel like they need to intervene, which makes their kids in many ways less resilient and more dependent upon their parents, and it becomes a cycle. I can't tell you how many high school seniors I've seen who tell me they don't want to grow up. I did a podcast on that about a year ago. So go back and listen to that. And today I've talked before about how much information parents are getting, and that's worsened obviously with social media, with the internet. You can click on anything and then there's 20 articles and a lot of them say opposite things. Also, technology has brought the infinite campus where parents can follow their kids all day. It's brought them things like that 360 app where they can follow their kids and their phones all day. Our kids are given cell phones when they're really young, too young, because our parents are so afraid that what happens, what am I going to do if something happens? It's not safe out there. My kid needs a phone in order to be safe. So I think there's a lot of reasons why parents have been pushed to become helicopter parents. There's a lot of reasons, and there's a lot of blame to go around about why parents are so scared and anxious about their parenting job, about their children, about their children's futures. I think they've been given information from experts and from the educational system that they need to be more involved. And there's less kids, so it's easier to be more involved. I was the third of 8 kids in my family growing up, and so my parents only had so many hands. They only had 4 hands, and so they couldn't bestow that much attention and all that on each of us because there are 8 of us. But we only have 1 kid or 2 kids. And also when you're older, if you're a 35 or 38-year-old parent, more educated, more settled in your career, you have more time perhaps and energy to invest. And then there's, with all those prescriptions for success and club teams and national championships and college scholarships and top schools and elite colleges, blah, 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 all that stuff, you can see what a quagmire it is for parents. It's so hard for parents to walk on the path that they want to walk on. So that's one suggestion I have. I'm going to do a podcast in the near future about what you can do about all this. I think it's so important for parents, and if their kids are old enough, for their kids together to form their own end in mind. The end in mind does not have to be what the culture says, or what the Joneses next door are saying, or what the club sports coaches and organizations are saying, or what the colleges are saying. It can be what you think, what you value, what your kids value. I think if we take charge of our end in mind for our family life, our role as parents, then we won't have to follow the prescription to lean in to make sure our kids are at the top of the heap and the best and the most unique and the most successful and at the top grades and are going on the best team, etc. Create your own end in mind and then use that to guide your decisions about parenting. Make sure you remind yourselves that there are reasons why you're being pushed to helicopter and overprotect and overdo and overindulge children, but you don't need to follow that script. And remind yourself too of the cost when you do, of kids who don't want to grow up, kids who are less resilient, kids who are less independent, kids who don't have a hard time taking initiative, kids who have more anxiety, and kids whose fears a lot of times hold them back, and then who end up requiring more care, and then it becomes a cycle. So take charge. Take charge of your parenting. Take charge of your parenting philosophy. Take charge of what your family values, and then follow that script so that you don't end up helicopter parenting. I get it. I understand why we've ended up in this place historically. I hope this podcast has helped you have a better frame of reference, but it doesn't mean you have to follow it. Make it your home, your parenting, do it your way. Check my website at www.drtimjordan.com for my show notes. I'll have a couple of links to some podcasts with some related topics that I've done, like those when I interviewed those high school seniors who don't want to grow up, etc. There's 2 or 3 links I'll put down there for you. We'll add to this topic. Come back next week. I'll be here with a brand new podcast. Pass these on to your friends. Please send me some suggestions for new podcast ideas. Send those ideas to my wife at Anne at drtimjordan.com. And Anne is ANNE at drtimjordan.com. I appreciate you taking the time to listen to these podcasts. I appreciate your feedback. I really appreciate it when you pass these on to your friends. And I will see you back here in a week. Thanks so much for stopping by.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Raising Daughters. Hopefully you've learned something useful about girls and young women and how to help them navigate the pressures, challenges, and opportunities of modern life. If you want to become a more effective parent, keep listening to the show at drtimjordan.com and let the conversations shape you. Build that one-of-a-kind connection with your daughters in the most profound and meaningful ways possible, shaping them into strong, confident women of the future. That's all for now. See you next week for another episode of Raising Daughters.